On today's show, we return to two comic formats we visited in the past: humor comics and webcomics. Now, I have too reviewed a webcomic. Justice League Beyond was a webcomic. It was originally published on the internet before moving to print.
Back to the matter at hand, both formats can be kind of a sticky wicket. See, webcomics tend to be passion projects, which is a fancy way of saying they don't really make any money. This leads to scheduling problems, which leads to angry fans, which leads to burnout creators, which ultimately leads to the comic either dying or just going dormant for a long time.
Now, of course, there are exceptions involved. Today's entry, PvP, is probably the most, if not one of the most successful webcomics. But I am speaking from a little bit of experience here, as I did try scripting a webcomic at one point. It was never published or uploaded anywhere, so don't try to look for it. Basically, the problem is I can't draw. I'm not an artist. Which means if I wanted to publish this in any way, shape, or form, I would need to hire an artist. And I need to pay them money to make sure they would never leave me high and dry at some point. And I just never got into the position where I could afford to do something like that. So all I'm left with are a bunch of scripts.
As for humor comics, well, if you recall my review of a book called Planetary Brigade, I pointed out the main problem with reviewing a humor book is falling into the trap of constantly explaining or just giving away the jokes in general, and thus negating the humor.
So what's the story behind today's comic? Well, for the uninitiated, the term PvP is an acronym for player versus player, and in gaming vernacular that refers to a special online server usually found in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, though it's appeared in a few other circumstances as well, where players face off against each other. This is as opposed to a PvE, or player versus environment server, where players all take on an artificial intelligence.
In 1998, writer-artist Scott Kurtz came up with the idea for a workplace comic set at a fictional gaming magazine called PvP. While initially a gaming-centric comic, over time PvP slowly morphed into more of a slice-of-life story, with overall geek culture references. The magazine was founded by Cole Richards, an earnest individual who was often nostalgia-blind, leading to him not really comprehending much modern technology. The magazine's creative director is Brent Sienna, Cole's childhood friend. Brent is overly snarky, wears sunglasses, and a studio intellectual whose love of Starbucks is only surpassed by his love of Apple computer products.
Also, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the name Brent Sienna is a play on the Crayola color burnt sienna, which is this weird sort of golden brownish tinge. Also, Brent's physical design is based on the lead character of the cult Sega Genesis classic Comix Zone.
The magazine's main critic/reporter is Jade Fontaine, who works to dispel the notions of gaming being a boys-only medium. Going into today's review, she has recently started a relationship with Brent. Providing tech support along with the occasional review is Frances Ottoman, a teenager whose mother is an ex-girlfriend of Cole's, so Cole hired Frances at her request. Frances is a devout PC gaming fan, leading him to often butt heads with the Mac-loving Brent. Then there's Skull, a troll who mysteriously appeared at the magazine offices not too long after Cole and Brent founded PvP. Rounding things out are Robbie and Jace, Cole's ex-college roommates who review sports games the other staff won't normally touch, like Madden. Or at least that's what they're supposed to be doing. Mainly they just sit around playing video games.
PvP would make its first appearance in print through a volume published by Dorkstorm Press in 2000. Then, in 2003, Scott Kurtz would enter an agreement with Image Comics to provide a monthly PvP comic that would reprint web strips alongside some special added material. And today we're looking at the first collection of those Image comic book issues. This is PvP at Large.
Frances comes to Cole after reading an article about Microsoft employees blowing off steam with Nerf gun fights. Cole rejects the idea, citing that Frances already spends most of his time surfing the net. Frances chooses to ignore Cole, managing to rope Brent and Skull in along the way, and Jay chooses to abstain, mainly because she wasn't asked to begin with. However, the fun and frivolity comes to an end with the discovery of a mouse in the office. Frances and Skull armor up to take the beast on, and it backfires, with the mouse quickly learning how to wield weapons. It all comes to end as the excitement proves too much and the mouse dies of a heart attack soon afterwards. Francis and Cole then resume their Nerf gun battles, that is until Jace winds up getting hit in the eye. While Jace goes to the doctor's, Skull decides to fill in for him on a gaming session. Upon his return, Jace bestows upon Skull a good luck gaming fez. Meanwhile, Cole has been going through some old personal items, namely his old Dungeons & Dragons books. It's inspired him to start a weekly gaming session at the office, despite Brent's objections not wanting to relive his nerdy childhood. While Cole and Brent go to a local gaming shop to pick up supplies, Francis begins preparing for what he thinks is a LAN party.
Are LAN parties still a thing?
Cole and Brent return to the office, and Cole sets up as dungeon masters while the other prepare for their characters. Francis is a thief, Jade a warrior, Brent a mage, and Skull a dwarf. The adventure begins, and though he's tried to play the too cool for school card, Brent is able to recall his Dungeons & Dragons past. As the session continues, Francis learns a very important lesson about stealing from Jade, and the gang learns a lesson about the dangers of Skull's flatulence. Not his character's flatulence, that's Skull's actual flatulence. Afterwards, Cole lends Francis a copy of Lord of the Rings so that he can learn where D&D came from. Unfortunately, all it does is lead Francis to believe that Tolkien totally ripped off Dungeons & Dragons. Meanwhile, Skull is looking for something to contribute to the magazine, so Cole makes him an intern, which is good because this means Cole doesn't have to pay him. Unfortunately, Skull just goes around making mistakes, including accidentally shredding important documents and preparing horrible coffee. Finally, Brent lashes out at Skull, and hours later, Jade finds a letter from Skull saying that he's run away. Due to Brent being the hardest on Skull and the likeliest reason for the troll running away, Cole tasks Brent with locating Skull. Brent tries asking both Son and Savage Dragon for help, but he comes up empty-handed. Eventually, Brent winds up making his way to the Liberty Meadows Animal Sanctuary.
Liberty Meadows is the name of a newspaper strip turned comic book created by Frank Cho. The story revolves around the denizens of the titular animal sanctuary run by a woman named Brandy Carter. No relation. Anyway, one of the unique aspects of the book is that Cho combined goofy-looking animal characters with his very voluptuous women models. Which, if you don't know, yes, Frank Cho's artwork does tend to be very, very cheesecakey.
Back at the office, Jade discovers Skull hiding out in the supply closet. She convinces Skull to keep hiding in order to teach Brent a lesson. Meanwhile, Brent tries asking Brandy about Skull's whereabouts, though in reality he's just ogling her. Eventually, Brent returns to PvP with a panda. A very, very temperamental panda. As the panda goes on a rampage, Cole and Brent hide in the supply closet, finding Skull in the process.
The panda does become a running gag throughout PvP, often attacking Brent at the mere mention of anything panda-related.
Francis comes into possession of a wireless webcam, which he shows to Skull. The teen knows just what to do with his new toy. He sets about placing the camera in Jade's office in order to capture the moment when she starts removing her top spontaneously. Which is what women do, according to National Lampoon.
Yes, this comic takes place during the time when webcams were considered technologically advanced.
Despite Skull's best attempt at helping, Jade not only fails to remove any clothing, but soon discovers the camera. She and Brent conspire to catch Francis by cutting the camera's feed just as it looks like Jade is actually going to go topless. Later, Brent talks to Francis. He doesn't harbor any ill will. He was a teenager once himself, but he does suggest avoiding Jade for a while. He then takes on Francis as an apprentice in the ways of deviance.
No good can possibly come of this.
Francis's learning takes a backseat to a more pressing concern. His ranking as the #1 Quake player has been usurped by someone using the name Devilfish. Francis challenges Devilfish several times, losing each time. He even goes as far as to drink a homemade concoction consisting of several highly caffeinated beverages. Francis slips into a catatonic state and then vomits all over Cole shortly after coming to. Francis goes home to recuperate, and Skull steps in to replace him in the next match. Even with his good luck gaming fez, Skull gets creamed. However, he does manage to bond with Devilfish over their mutual love of Pokemon. Devilfish is unaware that Skull is filling in for Francis, who actually hates Pokemon. Also, Skull invited Devilfish over to the PvP office for the next day. The next day, a young woman named Marcy Wisniewski arrives at the office. Realizing that Marcy is Devilfish, Cole and Brent try to break the news to Francis, who's none too happy to find out he lost to a girl.
Boy, thankfully women in gaming today don't have to deal with narrow-minded, misogynistic, sexist thoughts like this.
Francis's rage subsides when he sees Marcy and is instantly smitten. The two begin bonding and playing video games, even though Marcy keeps winning. Eventually, Francis thinks he might have a shot at kissing Marcy. She rebukes him, saying that she can't kiss him until he beats her at a game. After several failed attempts, Francis resorts to using a cheat code to finally defeat Marcy. But at the last minute, Francis's consciousness gets the better of him, and Marcy actually knew he cheated. The two decide to just be friends and not be so competitive. And then they start thumb wrestling. Meanwhile, a ghost from Cole and Brent's past has contacted Cole about a catch-up lunch. His name is Max Powers, and he went to school with Cole and Brent. He would constantly demean things that the two individuals liked, only to then use them for his own personal advantage. He was also very smug and passive-aggressive. Cole and Max go to lunch, where Max talks about being a corporate consultant, and Cole explains what PvP magazine is, Max thinking that games really haven't evolved too much since Pac-Man. He laughs at Cole off and pays for lunch. The next day, Cole arrives at the PvP office to a surprise. Max Powers is launching a new video game magazine, Power Play. Not only that, but he has taken the office next door to PvP and made his first hire, Marcy. Cole has had enough and immediately begins a prank war with Max. At one point, he tries using Skull in an attempt to scare Max, except Max can't actually see Skull. It turns out that only those who are of pure spirit can see trolls. Whatever that means. Finally, Jade steps in and forces Cole and Max to call a truce, though Cole does later decide to use Skull as a spy in the Power Play office. Sometime later, Skull comes to Brent for an opinion on a comic the troll has been working on, Grapha Maximo. It's not very good, but Brent suggests that Skull market his comic to the alternative crowd, because hipsters. Skull begins marketing Grapha Maximo to the alternative crowd and manages to get invited to the Tiny Press Expo. Skull goes to the expo where several people rave about Grapha Maximo, especially Robert Kirkman, creator of Pregnant Cat.
Yes, this is meant to be the same Robert Kirkman who you might know as one of the main creators of The Walking Dead. He and Scott Kurtz kind of both came to Image around the same time, and they wound up forming something of a friendship. The Pregnant Cat reference is a joke between Kirkman and Kurtz, where they would constantly talk about pitching a series to Image revolving around an expectant feline who was constantly craving pickles.
Finally, Skull addresses the expo as its keynote speaker. Grapha Maximo has been so warmly received that it's going to get a feature article in Wizard magazine. However, the mere mention of a mainstream magazine, especially Wizard, aka the El Duce of comics, causes a riot. It isn't all lost, though, as Skull returns to the PvP offices to find that he is a fanboy. Skull tries to raise the fanboy as his very own, but it's just too much responsibility for a troll, and eventually Skull releases the young man back out into the wild.
I should point out that I have actually kind of skipped over a few strips in this book. They're nothing really major, it's just they're not really big-time stories in the strictest sense of the term. They're just little humorous quickies, one revolving around the gang having decisive opinions on The Matrix Reloaded, and another one involving Jade turning into a Frank Cho drawing thanks to a cold. These things really don't add anything to the story, not to mention I could easily fall into the trap of just explaining the joke, which, if you remember what I said earlier, is a good way to ruin a humor book. Anyway, there are a couple that I do feel like I need to very briefly touch on.
The first takes place during the Grapha Maximo storyline. As an apology for constantly disparaging alternative comics, PvP gets replaced by a strip called Pirate vs. Ninja. Yes, I'm aware this is a gag. The second quickie story involves Scott Kurtz introducing readers to his father. Papa Kurtz makes several complaints about the modern world, in particular his son's swearing. Both Scott Kurtz and his father popping up in PvP becomes a recurring motif throughout series and serving as a story break on several occasions.
Okay, the reason why I touched on these two is, well, they do kind of feel a little important. I mean, in the Grapha Maximo story, Kurtz really does say some very harsh things about alternative comics. And like I said, the idea of Kurtz and his father showing up in the strip periodically throughout the series is a recurring motif. That being said, they really don't fit into the narrative that much, and that's why I'm only very, very briefly touching on them. Anyway, back to the main story.
Cole is super pumped for the release of Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, even going so far as to halt shaving and start wearing a fedora. One problem: he can't install the game on his computer because it's not compatible with its video card. Cole goes to CompUSA, but picking the wrong card can have dire consequences.
Coincidentally, this is why I don't do much PC gaming. It just doesn't seem very cost effective to constantly have to upgrade my equipment just to play one hot new game that's coming out. Not to mention, if I have to upgrade that equipment again, I might not be able to play that game again. I mean, I haven't been able to play any of the Telltale Adventure games, with the exception of Back to the Future, and that's just because that was a PlayStation Plus free giveaway.
Cole eventually decides to stop constantly upgrading his computer every time a new game comes out, and he elects to just get an Xbox instead. This upsets Francis, who extols the virtues of PC gaming until he sees the graphics of the Xbox. The fun in games comes to an end when Brent points out the similarities between the Xbox and Macs.
And so ends PvP at large. How was it? Well, I do really like a lot of this book. I think the humor is very good. There's some really nice characterization. I mean, each of the characters feels like a real individual. Yeah, even the troll. And no, in case you're wondering, the troll is not the most fanciful character to ever appear in PvP. Not to mention, if you're really in a bind, most of this material is actually available as an archive on the PvP website for completely free. Now, I do actually say most of that material because there's some parts of this story that aren't actually included in here. For example, not too terribly long after Mac's powers show up, Brent and Jade break up, and Jade briefly considers going to Power Play magazine. In fact, Brent and Jade don't reunite for like another year or so after that, which actually could have kind of been nice in this, or even in the next volume, which it isn't in there either. Also, like I said, the quickies do sometimes seem to interrupt the narrative flow a little bit. Like I said, it's particularly the Pirate versus Ninja and the Kurtz's dad appearance. Yeah, I know that they, like I said, they do sort of fit in the story a little bit, but at the same time, they don't feel like they're actually part of the PvP universe, mainly because they're referring to the guy who actually writes and draws the comic. But in the end, those are both kind of minor nitpicks. I do really enjoy PvP. It's one of the things I just look forward to reading almost every day. So I'm going to give PvP at large an A. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Hey guys, want to recommend a book to be placed in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box? Well, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcatproductions, Productions, or just check the link in the description below and see how you can help make that happen.